Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I'm Kelly Bailey. I'm a recruiter in the GTech organization here, so I'm really excited to be here to introduce Emily. So she is an author, and she specializes in science and culture. Her stories have been featured in a variety of publications like the New York Times and a couple of my favorite podcasts like This American Life and Radiolab. And she is also a recipient of the Pulitzer Travelling Fellowship, which I think allowed you to travel and research for the book that you're here to talk about today, The Dragon Behind the Glass. So welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I know that...
Thank you. Thanks.
I know that yesterday was the official release,
yeah,
right?
That's right.
How'd it go?
It was good. Yeah, it was really exciting to finally see it out. It's been a long time coming. So yeah, it was really exciting.
Well, congratulations. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know you just had a little one too, so super busy. But would you like to give us all like a quick summary of what your inspiration was and for the book? And
yeah, so I mean, I thought I would just start by telling people how I first heard about this fish, the Asian arowana, that The Dragon Behind the Glass is about. It was back in 2009, so 7 years ago. I was doing a radio story about the exotic pet trade in New York City, and I went with a pet detective up to the South Bronx to investigate reports of an alligator there. This guy was offering an alligator for sale on Craigslist.
It's normal.
So it was a big bust and a housing project and everything. But we didn't find the alligator, so I was pretty disappointed. But he kept telling me about these illegal, super expensive fish that were being smuggled into the city from Southeast Asia. He said that they were considered good luck in certain cultures. They were thought to bring prosperity, and for that reason they had been over-harvested from the wild and were commanding these high prices. They were protected by the U.S. Endangered Species Act, so you can't bring them across the border of the United States legally as a pet. So anyway, I was totally not thrilled to hear this because I was hoping to find some kind of huge animal that you wouldn't expect to find in the city for my story. I kept trying to steer him away from fish. But then I got home and I kept thinking about, like, he told me that this one Wall Street banker had broken down in tears when he had his illegal fish confiscated from him. And I kept thinking, this is pretty wacky. Like, I wonder what would make somebody so compelled to own a species that they would take such risk, because people actually go to prison for this in some cases. So I looked up the species and I started doing some research, and I was just absolutely astounded by what I found. So I thought what I would do is start off with a very short reading from the book, explaining what happened after I got home from that failed alligator bust. So this is what I read. Forget oil and diamonds. The next big thing in Southeast Asia is fish, I read in the hobbyist magazine Practical Fish Keeping, which described how 50 specimens, collectively valued at $1 million, had been placed under 24-hour guard in Jakarta, Indonesia. While these fish may be disappearing from the wild, their popularity amongst Asia's richest is ever increasing. In some instances, the species was reared on farms that could pass as prisons, facilities protected by nested walls, watchtowers, and Rottweilers that prowled the perimeters at night. The reason for the heavy security became clear as I dug deeper into an international news archive that chronicled a spate of fish thefts across Southeast Asia. In Malaysia, 5 arowana stolen from a woman's house were worth more than all her other possessions combined. Singapore, which boasts one of the lowest crime rates in the world, once reported 4 such heists in a single week. One thief punched out an elderly woman who chased him as he made off with her prized fish in a sloshing bucket. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison and 12 strokes of a wet cane. As for who was taking the fish, some surmised that the thieves were fish lovers who could not afford the astronomical prices. Others suspected that a crime syndicate was behind the thefts, a sort of shadowy fish mafia. Bolstering this theory was a harrowing case in Indonesia where an arowana dealer and his heavily armed cronies allegedly kidnapped and held for ransom a Japanese buyer. Despite all this criminality, however, the trade in the farmed fish was legal not only in Asia, but throughout most of the world, including Canada and Europe, the one major exception, other than the United States, being Australia, which bans the species to protect its own tropical fauna. A few years back, a 45-year-old housewife was arrested at the Melbourne airport trying to enter the country with 51 fish, including an Asian arowana, hidden beneath her poofy skirt. We became suspicious after hearing these flipping and flapping noises, a customs official later told the press. Such absurd tales of smuggling kept me up late as I pored through the 100-some articles I'd printed out and spread across my living room floor. The picture that gradually emerged, however, looked less like the illegal drug trade and more like a parody of Manhattan's overheated art scene, complete with record-breaking prices, anonymous buyers, stolen specimens, unsavory dealers, and even clever fakes. Whatever the best metaphor, it seemed the Asian arowana had a long history of driving human beings to dangerous extremes. One summer in college, I'd read Jane Goodall's In the Shadow of Man, and ever since I dreamed of venturing into the jungle to write a great story about wildlife. Around the time my curiosity in the arowana began, I'd been awarded a fellowship intended to fund a reporting project abroad. Now I knew how I'd use it. I would go see for myself where all these smuggled arowana were coming from and what made the species so irresistible. Goodall had her noble tool-wielding primates. I would have a bad-tempered, bony-tongued fish. It was obvious where to start. At the center of the glamorous world of Southeast Asian aquaculture reigned a flamboyant Singaporean tastemaker known as Kenny the Fish, a chain-smoking millionaire fond of posing nude behind strategically placed aquatic pets. The fish's real name was Kenny Yap, and he was the executive chairman of an ornamental fish farm so lucrative that it was listed on Singapore's main stock exchange. Recently, the Singaporean press had dubbed him one of the city's most eligible bachelors and called for him to host a national spin-off of Donald Trump's reality show, The Apprentice. To enter his website, I had to click on his belly button. I've since come to think of this navel as the rabbit hole into which I fell, not to emerge for some 3.5 years.
Oh my gosh, I'm not going to lie. When I first started reading this book, I thought it was fiction because this Kenny the Fish character sounded so outlandish. He sounds like he's straight out of The Godfather. So could you tell us what your expectations and impressions were? Because you actually had the opportunity to see him in his natural environment and meet him. So what were your impressions?
Right, in his natural habitat.
In his natural habitat.
Yeah, so Kenny really drew me into this story, and I was thinking back on it, and for me, he's a little bit like the wizard in The Wizard of Oz. So I kind of started with him, and then I went off on this strange adventure. But he was always kind of the man behind the curtain. There was just this glamorous world that I was kind of trying to get behind.
Totally.
And he represented the public face of that. So yeah, Singapore actually exports more pet fish than any other country in the world. So that it makes sense that I would start there. And he's kind of like the kingpin of this industry. They used to be famous. I mean, it's been true of a long time that Singapore is the hub of the trade, but they used to be famous for guppies. They were called Guppy Kingdom, and I mean, the guppy versus the arowana is a big difference.
A little bit.
Yeah, not just in size. The guppy's like this big, and the arowana is pretty huge, but also in price and sort of mystique and so forth. So Kenny had kind of come along at a point where there was sort of the sexy makeover of the ornamental fish trade, a very traditional trade. And he knew how to kind of give it this exciting new face. Yeah, I mean, he has a very carefully crafted image. So, for example, he came up with his own nickname, Kenny the Fish, and he was actually, he told me he was getting a passport photo taken when he was suddenly inspired to strip down to a G-string and just pose with a fish. So, I'm sure.
It's normal.
Yes,
I think we've all been there.
Yeah, right. So I'm sure that the photographer was surprised, but probably also thrilled. So he definitely represented a lot of color. you know, he calls himself naughty a lot, so he would say, you know, I'm just naughty, I'm just playful and naughty. But the truth is, but it's all in like this very innocent, fun way, and sort of shiny, happy, smiley way. I say he always has a practiced expression of ecstatic delight, because his face is plastered everywhere, not just on his farm, but also throughout Singapore and some places. He's a bit of a celebrity, so he's always like just beaming in ecstasy. But yeah, so but when I asked him about, and so he offered me this wonderful kind of entry point into the world of the arowana. But when I asked him about kind of, well, what about all these fish robberies that I read about? He was like, you know, what fish robberies? And I thought, I didn't know, that wasn't the answer I expected. So yeah, it was always this weird tension between sort of the fact that the fish hobby is, or pet fish themselves are these like very innocent things. I mean, we associate them with childhood, and the hobby itself is very educational and kind of sweet. Yeah, there was this tension between that and then the fact that there is indeed a darker side to the trade, and there is a genuine sense of menace that's connected with this fish. So, for example, a Malaysian member of parliament, while I was reporting on this, received a text message with a dead arowana, and they took it seriously as a death threat. Like that was,
oh my gosh.
Yeah, actually, even stranger, while I was reporting on this, the head of the Indonesian National Police, the chief detective of the Indonesian National Police, which is the equivalent of the FBI, was brought down by the fish. So he landed in prison over a bribe that he had taken related to one of these fish farms.
Oh my God.
So it just always seemed like the fish was connected to very high places, and you could never quite tell what was true. I talked to at one of these farms. It took me a while to find a farm that was willing to talk about some of the fish robberies that were going on. Some were reported in the press, but largely people would say that they hadn't heard of it. And finally I found this guy who said he had been robbed 8 times in the last decade, so he had been tied up, and there were just bandits coming and taking the fish in the night. And nobody was quite sure who was behind it and so forth, so that kind of thing. There were rumors even of fish-related murders, and it took me a very long time to pin down whether there was any truth to that.
Yeah, I'm sure. And with a character like Kenny the fish, like where do you start?
Yeah, right.
So Kenny the fish isn't the only kind of just very outlandish, I want to say character, but they're real people in this book.
Right.
So I do feel like sometimes just the lines between fiction and nonfiction, I was like constantly confused. But as you were writing the book, what would you say were some of like your greatest challenges when you were researching and meeting these different characters and people looking for the arowana?
Yeah. Right, so you talk about how outlandish the world is, and so the whole book is definitely nonfiction, and so because I was doing a nonfiction book, I really needed to know what the truth was, and it's definitely kind of a smoke and mirrors world, so it was separating myth from reality was one of the biggest challenges, and it took a long time in some instances. So one of the first things that I wanted to find out was that so the fish actually, it's a lot like the art market, as I said before. Most of the fish sell when they're about the size of a finger, like when they're just babies, and they sell for maybe like $1,000, $2,000. But it goes up from there, and it depends on all kinds of very particular details of the fish, like its finnage, which is not a word I used to use a lot, but is a word, and its scales and like the shape of its eye, and it's also its deportment, its personality. You want a fish that's pretty aggressive. You don't want one that's just like nice, apparently. Right. Yeah, it's basically the highest recorded prices were in the 6 figures, and but it was always an anonymous buyer, like some anonymous Japanese man had bought this fish for $150,000, and you're like, did that really happen? Is that just some kind of? So I was really, really determined to get to the bottom of it, And I attended, so when I went to meet Kenny the fish, I was incredibly fortunate. It was a really opportune moment to have landed in Singapore because Aquarama was going on. Aquarama is, it's this huge event. It's the Westminster Dog Show of pet fish. So little showfish show up in their plastic baggies and compete for top prizes. But the Arowana are by far like the star attraction of this show. So when I was there, there were the biggest thing that happened that year were that there were these 10 albino arowanas. So albinos were the ones that sold for the most money historically, but they would appear on the market like, I don't know, it was like a rare Vermeer, like coming to light. But this was like all of a sudden there are 10 of them. Nobody knew where they came from or who owned them or what was going on. And so I tracked down the guy who had bred them, and it was like this crazy story about this like Indonesian coal tycoon who was crazy about albinos, and he had a zoo in Borneo that was just albino animals. And so he had there was word came to him of birth of an albino at one of these farms, and he traveled to to see it, and he stared at the fish all night, and then he said to the farmer, you must stop selling fish. And then he started, it was like this long 7-year period of breeding them and then breeding the offspring with each other, and then eventually they bred these albinos. So the idea was that they were just going to sell them to celebrities and royalties, one to each country. It reminded me of like the golden tickets in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So he told me the Sultan of Johor had bought one, and the high-ranking member of the Chinese Communist Party had bought a fish supposedly for, he said, $300,000.
Oh my gosh!
So I was like, I have to meet one of these people, because I wasn't willing to believe that it was true. So he actually arranged for me to go meet the guy who had bought one of these fish in Taiwan. He's a plastics magnate who made his fortune manufacturing toothbrush bristles, of all things, and Barbie hair. And when you think about it, they're very similar. So so he made all this money off of his toothbrush bristles, and he spent $150,000 on his fish, according to him. It's like the art market. There's no downside to saying that you paid a certain amount. So both the dealer and the buyer will sometimes inflate the prices, but I do believe they sell for a lot of money, whatever the exact figure may be.
Yeah, I still can't wrap my mind around how much some of the fish in the book that you were describing were being sold for. So speaking of the Arowana, you guys have seen the cover. This is the Arowana. It is really dramatic. When I first picked up the book, I was like, what is this? Is it actually a fish? I thought it was a dragon, legitimately. What would you say are, well, first, I guess, is this the actual super red Arowana that you were looking for? And then how did you go about choosing this particular image, or how did you choose this for the cover?
Well, I agree. I love the cover. So the publisher did that, Scribner did that, and they did a beautiful job. I think they did a gorgeous job on the cover.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
But it is the super red, so which nobody in here knows what we're talking about. But so the fish, so Arowana, I should also just back up for a second and explain that it's a family of fish. So there's 7 species across the tropics of the globe. And the really expensive one is the Asian Arowana. That's also the most endangered one. And it comes in these different color varieties because of the islands throughout Southeast Asia. You have different populations that have evolved in these different land masses. So that there's 3 main ones: green, gold, and red. Green, forget about it. You don't want a green one. I'm not sure why, but gold and red are both very valuable. Gold is sort of a more recent, it's become more popular more recently. But the classic one is this fish called the super red, and it comes from a single lake system in the heart of Borneo. And I actually became, so I wanted to know if the fish still existed in the wild, and I became somewhat obsessed with it, especially on that, beginning on that first trip when I had gone over to Singapore, because I was hearing all kinds of things, you know, oh yeah, they're still there, they're in the heart of Borneo, it's fine, the population is doing really well. And other people say it's totally gone, like it doesn't exist anymore. So I was like, okay, I'm going to find out. So I ended up canceling my flight home after I went to see the Taiwanese toothbrush bristle tycoon, and I flew back to Borneo to try to get there. And basically, I mean, I ended up knee deep in a swamp, realizing like I have no idea how to do this. How do you know if a fish is there? You know, it took me so long to get to the swamp, and then it's like, I don't know. It's black water, so you can't even see into it. And I had never been fishing a day in my life. I didn't speak the language, so yeah, I went home and I felt like a total failure. So I felt like I had failed at that. And I kept thinking about this man who I felt could have helped me. He was someone who I had met at Aquarama. He's a superstar in the fish world. His name is Heiko Blair. He's a German ichthyological explorer. In fact, he's a third-generation German ichthyological explorer. So his grandfather had like one of the biggest ornamental fish farms in the world in 1900, at the turn of the century, in Frankfurt. And then his mother took him and his 3 siblings, so her 4 children, to the Amazon rainforest, to an uncharted section of the Amazon, which is still pretty wild today. But in the 1950s, this was just completely unheard of. He was 7 years old. She took them to go find what was then the most expensive pet fish in the world. It was a fish called the discus, which is this like perfectly round fish that looks like the Greek discus. So she went in search of this elusive discus fish. And then they got lost, and they ended up living among cannibals for 2 years. So, so I was like, so Heiko Blair, since then, he had basically never stopped in the manic pursuit of new species. I mean, he was just all over the world. I would run into him, and he would say, you know, I've been to Tajikistan and Australia. He was everywhere all the time, constantly traveling. It was just, he was kind of like the Jacques Cousteau of freshwater or something. But yeah, so I started thinking about this man and thinking that he was the one who could have helped me. And the book came about when he looked me up when he came through New York. And I just got this idea that the 2 of us would go find this fish in Borneo. And that would be how the story went. And of course, you know that it took many twists and turns that I had not expected.
Yeah, I mean, everyone should read this book. Like, it was absurdly, like, I was at the edge of my seat.
Thank you.
So I guess I was, to pivot a little, I was surprised going through the book. I was, expecting like an Indiana Jones pursuit of this arowana. But what kind of struck me was how much like conservation came up throughout I just feel like notes of conservation and just the environment came up throughout the book. And you explain at some point that because of supply and demand, there's these fish farms, and they're breeding these arowana and other rare fish, which may be causing like a negative effect with the natural wild population. And I thought that was just very surprising and something I hadn't really thought of before. What would you say are maybe like a few of the surprising things that you learned while writing Dragon Behind the Glass?
So one of the first surprising things I learned came right out of the mouth of Kenny the fish when I landed in Singapore. I was talking to him about what made the fish so valuable, and I thought he was going to talk about Feng Shui and all these, some kind of ancient Chinese tradition, basically. And he didn't. He was talking about some treaty that's administered by the United Nations, and that the fish is on it. And I didn't sort of put it all together at first, but basically I thought that there would be this deep history to this fish in Asian cultures, and there simply wasn't. Just a few decades back, people were eating this. This was what you ate for dinner in the swamp. And it wasn't even a good food fish. That's kind of an aside, but people complain it's kind of bony and bland. So, but right in the 60s, Southeast Asia was losing a lot of its jungles to development. And at the same time, this fish is it's a very large fish. It's an apex predator, and it's a slow reproducer. Some of them can take up to 6 years to reproduce. So populations were dwindling. And it was right at the time that the international community was trying to figure out how we could organize the trade in animals and threatened animals so that we could kind of get our act together and protect them from the international trade. And it's almost as a fluke that this fish ended up as a kind of test case in conservation. It got put on this list called CITES, which is now one of the largest conservation agreements in the world. But at the time it was brand new. It was put on Appendix 1, which is like the rarest of the rare species, and it was subject to an international trade ban. And very soon thereafter, it became this coveted commodity. Now, it's very difficult to prove causality versus correlation, right? But what I can say is it just was not a phenomenon until it had this kind of official stamp of rarity, and that now conservation biologists, some of them, have looked and said that, in fact, you do have to be careful about the perception of rarity, and when you're declaring an animal endangered, that it doesn't suddenly spike its price on the black market. But you know, it's interesting too, looking at this fish, it really is an encapsulation of the history of conservation, the modern history of conservation, because originally the idea was just to ban everything. That was kind of what we started out by doing. And then gradually there was a move towards sustainable trade. So the example that's often given, and I talk about a little bit in the book, is crocodilians, crocodiles and alligators. They were pushed to the brink of extinction. Almost, you know, a huge number of the species on Earth were just in terrible in a terrible way after World War II, because there's so much demand for crocodile leather.
Yeah.
And then they tried banning the trade in crocodilians. It didn't really work. What worked was ranching them. So you basically would go into their natural habitat, collect some eggs, raise them on these farms, and then sell their skins. And this was probably the greatest conservation success story of the last quarter of the 20th century. And for that reason, that's when the arowana was in a bad way, the Asian arowana. In the 90s, they tried doing the same thing with it. So they had this farming program that arose. But there's a difference between ranching an animal, where you have a connection with a wild population, and farming an animal where it's a closed system and the whole life cycle of the fish is within the walls of a farm. So very rapidly you start to domesticate the creature. That's one issue. And the other is that there's no value placed on preserving the wild habitat. So yeah, that is kind of, and some people still think that it's a good way to go for certain threatened species, and I would say you have to take it on a case-by-case basis. But people who oppose it, they say it's because it creates a market where there wasn't one before.
Right.
So after CITES came in and started these farming programs, so when you buy the fish on the legal market, it's actually it has a little microchip in it that shows that it comes from a certified farm, and yeah, there's kind of a rigorous certification process. So they're not coming from the wild for the most part. They really are farmed. But it created this huge, I call it a mass-produced endangered species, because now, I mean, it's just everywhere. It's been sold, more than 1 million of them have moved that we know of, insofar as they're tracked between borders, but probably many more, because that doesn't take into account the markets within the countries that actually produce them.
So I guess you've kind of touched on it a little bit already, but I was wondering if there were any key takeaways that you were hoping, you know, in relation to the environment, that you're trying to get across to your readers.
Yeah, so I mean, when I set out to write this book, I didn't want to write a book about the environment. I was really attracted to, I mean, I don't think it says something great about me, but I was attracted to sort of the ridiculousness of the story, and like the humor and high drama of the fish world, and like, you know, the old lady getting punched out for her fish. Like, I just was, yeah, I was very into that. But the truth is, you really can't write about the arowana or any fish, I think, today without coming face to face with an enormous amount of loss. And this is particularly true of freshwater fish. So a lot of times when we talk about the state of fish today, people tend to focus on marine species, especially big ones like the tuna. And the tuna is not doing well, so I don't mean to suggest that tunas are okay. But the truth is that marine fishes are in much better shape than freshwater fishes. So freshwater is 2.5% of the Earth's water, and then you might have heard this before, but then available freshwater, so surface freshwater, freshwater that's not frozen or buried deep beneath the ground, that's 1/100th of 1% of the Earth's water, and it actually supports over half of the world's, nearly half of the world's fish species. So there are about 30,000 fish that are known today, and nearly half of them live in freshwater. And the reason for that is that it kind of functions like islands. It's like aquatic islands. So the same reason that islands tend to be hotbeds of speciation, same thing with freshwaters. And so it's really a crucible of the Earth's biodiversity, and these are incredibly vulnerable habitats, and we've done just a terrible job in terms of dams, in terms of pollution. And a lot of these fish, I mean, we haven't paid a tremendous amount of attention. So what happens is that, you'll put up a dam somewhere in the Amazon, and then fish go extinct that we didn't even know existed, because frankly, the numbers are, most fish live in the tropics. Most freshwater fish, the vast majority, live in the tropics, and they've just been very poorly studied and poorly characterized.
Sure. Okay, so kind of going back to the beginning with the lieutenant up in the Bronx that you were shadowing, it really seemed like you had only just scratched the surface of the issue of exotic pet trade in the US, and then it kind of went all over the globe. If you had the option, or perhaps the time, resources, what would you want to learn more about exotic pets, specifically in the US?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I definitely did just scratch the surface. It was really crazy. Yeah, I feel like there were so many stories, and the Arowana was the one that caught me in particular. But when I called up this pet detective initially, he was telling me about 1,300 turtles living in this Soho apartment, and the owner didn't have room for a bed, and a guy in Harlem with a tiger and an alligator that were best friends according to him, but the detective was skeptical. But yeah, I mean, there's just so many stories, and the truth is it's not a highly I mean, during my reporting, I think I mentioned I ended up visiting, a man went to prison in New York City. Actually, he was sent to a prison where we put John Gotti Jr. and also the Al-Qaeda member who was going to blow up the New York subway system. He got sent to the same prison, and then there was this guy who was in there for having pet fish. And so I went to visit him, and he was like, yeah, he was a pretty sweet guy. Not to say, I mean, he was smuggling them. He would freely admit them.
Yep.
Yeah, but he was just very genuinely enthusiastic about this fish. His fish Rosie, he wasn't allowed to know where she was. Now she was confiscated, but he believed she was living in a Texas aquarium, and he was like dying to get out so that he could go visit her. So yeah, I mean, it's just these stories. I mean, it's very strange in some cases, the criminalization of some of these things, and I think that there's just so many stories to be told. The Arowana was my particular passion, I guess.
Sure, yeah.
So the one that I started on.
And I think you've mentioned it already, but just for the audience, like, I thought the Arowana was this small, like, goldfish, but it's quite large, right?
It's like the size of a samurai sword. So, but they do sell when they're small.
Right.
So when they're smuggling them, they would usually be little. Because yeah, I think that was actually one of the most basic questions I lose sight of now. I've been on this subject for so many years, but I think one of my first questions was how
do you smuggle a samurai sword?
Fish? Like, what do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the guy who went to prison, he just had them in his suitcase. So you put them in plastic baggies with water, and then they can make it. That's how the aquarium trade ships fish anyway.
Sure.
So Yeah, but yeah, fish smuggling. But they do get quite big. And they're carnivorous. Like they're called the bony tongues because they have these bony tongues. But they use them to catch prey. So they'll leap out of the water many feet, and they'll grab things that are on low-hanging branches. So like even birds, snakes. Most of their diet is probably smaller fishes and bugs. They love cockroaches. They're huge on cockroaches.
Right.
But yeah, actually, most of the people who keep them, they feed them live food, which makes them, I think, a somewhat difficult pet to maintain.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie, it would be a little bit scary to feed samurai swordfish like live prey. So
yeah, don't Google Arowana eats duckling. Do not.
I almost feel like we should put this up here right now. But
no, I wouldn't.
Yeah, so your journey across, this entire story takes you over 15 different nations, countless meetings, and a surprising number of, there's a lot of scientific rivalry, fish collecting rivalry, just rivalries all around in the book. Were there any specific events or maybe relationships that you came across in your trips that really stood out and impacted you?
Yeah, so you brought up the scientific rivalries, and it's true, I kind of got caught in the middle of these two ichthyologists. I was a little bit of a pawn, I think, but
you don't hear that very often.
Yeah, exactly, a pawn between ichthyologists. That may be the first time
I don't think I've ever heard that before.
But yeah, so I ended up going after a new species of arowana in Myanmar, and that was probably one of the more striking experiences in the book for me, because it was still very closed at that point. It was just as it was starting. I mean, actually, the truth is, where I went, it's still closed. I heard recently from somebody who came back from, it's the southern tail of Myanmar that's next to Thailand there, and it's the site of the longest running civil war on Earth. So even though things are looking a little bit up for the region now, it still is just a very closed jungle. You can't go there easily. Yeah, I think I was surprised by how many fish remain to be discovered in the world. I don't think I'm giving anything away when I say that this new Myanmar arowana, there actually was a new species that is now in the books. And I mean, this is the last kind of fish that you would expect to find undiscovered in the modern world. It's a large fish, it's a high profile fish. It was just bizarre. And the fact that I could show some interest and then it would turn out to be, I don't know, this thing had been lurking in the jungles all these years, not being noticed. It was strange. And I think it's just indicative of how little attention is paid to freshwaters in general. And it also kind of reflects something that's happened in biology. So if you look back at the history of biology, straight back to the very beginning, Aristotle was actually, the father of biology, was a big fish man. So he just, long story short, basically, he thought he would take over Plato's academy, his mentor, after Plato died, but he got passed over for the job, so he was very irritated. He takes off, he goes to Lesbos, which is an island that's now in the news a lot because the Syrian refugees are coming through, and that's where he essentially invented biology, by studying the fish. He wrote Historia Animalium, which is his longest work, but it's also his most neglected. And he was the first person to kind of sit down and start to write a natural history of what was what. Yeah, so in the 1950s, though, up to the middle of the 20th century, biologists used to divide themselves, kind of specialize in one group of organisms. So you had ichthyologists who specialized in fish, or people who specialized in birds or earthworms. I mean, it got very specific. And then came the molecular revolution with the discovery of the structure of DNA, and the funding really shifted. So that specialists in whole animals started to get pushed out. And today, it's just, somebody told me that ichthyology is a bit passé, and I think that's, I mean, yeah, that was an ichthyologist who said that, so it's an insider view. But it's true. I feel like that is we're losing a tremendous amount of knowledge because of just the way that the funding is structured now. And when the current generation dies, there are going to be whole groups of animals for which no living expert remains.
Has Heiko had any children?
Heiko?
Yeah, has he had any children to carry on this?
Yeah, actually, so yeah, he has a little girl. He named her after his mother, the one who took him into the Amazon. So
okay, so then we at least have that to go on.
She is well on her way to no, it's true.
To continuing
right,
the trade, the family trade.
Important work, yeah, exactly.
So I know at the end of your book, you said that you're done chasing after Heiko, because there are quite a few parts throughout the book where you're just kind of like, where is he? Is he going to show up?
Yeah.
At least for now. So I'm just curious, what are you currently working on, or what are you hoping to maybe dig your research into next?
Yeah, so yeah, I did spend a lot of time waiting for Heiko around the globe. I think I say in there I've waited for him on 4 continents at this point.
It's got to be a record.
Yeah, so right, but at this point, so I just had a baby recently, a few months ago, and so I'm kind of focused on that. But the interesting thing to me, actually, as I was writing this, I was thinking about it's a very male-dominated world, the aquarium world, and especially the Arowana world. Like, it's a very masculine fish, and all the hobbyists that I met were men, with maybe like one exception. And also I was writing about the history of exploration in science, and so also very male-dominated. Yeah, but there were these 2 characters that I think sort of spoke to me. So one was in the 1850s, this Austrian explorer, Ida Pfeiffer, who discovered the lake, or is often credited, at least, with discovering the lake where the super red comes from in the heart of Borneo. So she was a housewife, and she raised 2 sons, and she was like a piano teacher, and she just had dreams of traveling. And when they were fully grown, when her sons were fully grown, she just took off. She told them she was going to Brazil, but she didn't tell them she was going to go home the long way around. So she circumambulated the globe, which at that time would be like being gone for 2 years, you know. But yeah, she was really an extraordinary woman, and so I admire her a lot. And then there's another model, which is Heiko's mother, where you just take the kids to the jungle, right? So so those things are all like on my mind. But
so what are your plans for childcare for your child?
Exactly. You just bring them along. So the baby Bjorn in the Amazon. Yeah. So actually right now I'm working on an essay about, it's much closer to home. I was like, I have to write about something closer to home. So it's about my bird feeder, which sounds incredibly boring, but let me warn you that pet fish also sounded boring when I told everybody I was writing about pet fish, and they were not. But yeah, I live on the 25th floor of an apartment building in New York, so it's kind of hard to have a bird feeder, because if you put it outside the window, it's going to fall and kill people. So I found one that goes inside, the bird comes inside the house. And initially, the guy who sold it to me up in Maine was like, you're not going to get any birds. And we ended up getting some house finches. Now this connects back to this fish story, because yeah, there's a whole elaborate saga of what happened with the house finches. Spoiler alert, a hawk ate one in our living room.
Oh my gosh.
But yeah, it turns out that the house finches are an introduced species here. They were brought over in the pet trade from the West Coast in around 1940, I think it was, and just a few of them were released on Long Island because the dealer knew that it was illegal to have them, and he got worried, and so he released them, and now there's like 1 billion of them on the East Coast. So, so yeah, I think that this book certainly has informed the way that I just look at every animal now, and that may be my next pet trade subject. Yeah. I
love this. You're like the new generation, like Ace Ventura,
yeah, exactly.
Detective Emily Voigt.
Thank you.
But I guess I'd love for us to open it up to Q&A if anyone out there has questions. I think there was maybe we have the mic.
Here.
No, it's over there.
Did you ever feel like you were in danger in some of the places you visited?
Yeah, I always felt like I was in danger, but whether I was actually in danger, like I said last night with the book launch, somebody asked the same question, and I said that basically I was always worried about something. So for example, when I had to get to the heart of Borneo, I was worried about these 3 different things. People had warned me that there were Islamic terrorists in the jungle, and there was an election about to happen in Indonesia, so that they would potentially want to kidnap somebody. And so I couldn't even get a travel agency to help me at all. And I was worried about that. I was worried about the fish mafia, because I could never tell if it was real or not. And so I'd be talking to people and like wanting to ask about the fish mafia, but also wondering if they were part of it, you know? So it was like, that was, yeah, it sounds very funny, but at the time I was like a little nervous about it. And the other thing was headhunters. So the indigenous people that live on this lake were traditionally headhunters. And so I got warned that there was still headhunting going on. And that I thought was totally ridiculous. I'm like, this is, you know, it just doesn't happen anymore. It's this like horrible characterization of a peaceful tribe. Yeah, I was wrong about that. So like, so I was always worried about something, and I was always worried about the thing I shouldn't have been worried about, and not worried about what I should have. So it's like, you know, that was happening. But it kept getting worse and worse in a way too. So by the end of the book, I was like, okay, I'm just going to go to the Amazon really quick and meet Heiko. And then he sent me the itinerary, and it was like the hub of the FARC activity in Colombia, and I was, I felt like this fish had put me through the ringer by the end. Yeah. So the answer is yeah.
Hi, thanks for coming. I look forward to reading the book. Should I invest money and time into genetically modifying the fish so I can make my own super red to sell to people in Asia? And also, what do you expect your book to be, I guess, received in Asia?
Right. Oh, okay, these are good questions. The first thing is, so Kenny the fish might be ahead of you on that. And so they are working on genetically modifying the arowana. But it's surprisingly tough. They still can't do in vitro with the fish, so that makes it really hard. Like arowana are super picky lovers. They insist upon picking their own mate. They won't just mate with any other fish. So yeah, and actually a surprising number remain mated for life. Yeah. So you could, but you know, I don't know how you're going to get the fish into the U.S. And I would warn you against going down this path. So what was your other question? It was reception in Asia. I think that there's so much interest in the fish that so far people seem pretty excited about the book. It's really different from, there are a lot of arowana books that exist, but they're all like fish care, so a lot of times people will think that I've written a fish care book. I think I am right now #1 in fish and aquarium care on Amazon. So yeah, don't mean to boast, but yeah, so I think you know, we'll have to see what people think of it, but I think they'll probably be interested, because it's I mean, the thing about the aquarium hobby is that there's something so admirable about it, because these people know the names of things. They know the names of species that the scientific names of species that most people, I mean, most of us have no idea, and how they fit together in terms of the evolution and where they're from and so forth. And they're really interested in the natural world and in the wild and holding on to a piece of wild. I think that's what sort of attracts people to it, as much as sort of the like looking like a dragon and the good luck stuff. I think it's also like a deeper kind of desire to connect with nature. And so yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if people are very interested in kind of exploring the history of that.
What's the first city in Asia? Is Asia part of your book tour?
Is Asia part of my book tour? Yeah, so Aquarama just moved. So it just moved from Singapore, where it's been since like '89, to Guangzhou, because what happened is with the rise of the Chinese middle class, the arowana became popular first in Taiwan, then Japan, and now it's China. It's all about China. And so that's had big consequences on the trade. And so yeah, Aquarama is happening in the fall in Guangzhou. So I may be there with the baby Bjorn. So
I have a question.
yeah.
Is the fish world that like the black market, is it a very small world that everyone knows everyone and they're like, why is this like blonde lady poking around kind of thing? Or is it just big and it's just random and they didn't know like about you before you met them?
No, it was the first one.
Really small.
Yeah, it was definitely the first one. And also, yeah, I stuck out a lot because it's a hobby that's pretty much predominantly Asian men. So like I would go to these fish conferences and like it was kind of obvious. And at first people were incredibly welcoming. So it is kind of a closed world, but the US is also the largest market for pet fish. And so the fact that it's a closed market is not great for the industry. And so there's an interest in opening up the US, and they've been trying to communicate with the US. And I have to say that American policy, it's not exactly informed. Like there's not like deep knowledge about the fish that informed the fact that it's banned here. Whether or not it should be, that's a different question. But they were just happy to have somebody who was paying attention finally, who might be able to communicate the real message of the fact that these fish are farmed and so forth. And so I found that gave me a lot of access, which was great. But what was funny was that as the project went on for years and years, like I would run into them all over the world. So at like a fish convention in Jakarta, and then like the next fall they see me in Guangzhou, and they're like, it became apparent to them that I was like just chasing this fish all the time. And they would tell me like, well, what are you doing? You haven't written your book yet? And I would say, no, I'm studying your obsession. And they would look at me and kind of like, you should examine your own obsession. You know what I mean? Like they're going back to their daily jobs. Like the fish is a fun side thing for them. You know what I mean? Even the most passionate. Yeah, and whereas I was like, I'm going to find this thing in the wild, So, yeah, so I did. I definitely was noticed. I didn't go undercover. Any other questions?
So what makes a fish worth $100,000 versus $10,000 versus $50,000 in the arowana world?
Huh. Yeah, so I know probably more than I care to about the details of what makes a fish valuable. But it's really rarity and the perception of rarity. So in the case of the albinos, the idea was that they don't come. I mean, that's what's so ridiculous about the albinos too, because the fish, the normal fish is valued for its coloration, and the super red is valued because it's super red, like it's right there in the name, right? So if you have a fish that's born not being red at all, it seems like it would be worth less, But it's totally white. But it's like, it's cool because it's something that people don't see a lot, and it has this perception of rarity, and so and it's really a status symbol. So if you can have something that nobody else has, that's the big draw, and so that's why the albinos sell for 6 figures. In terms of the other fish, it's how red they are, it's their scales, it's so there's all these things that can go wrong on the fish. Like you don't want the fish to look depressed, and sometimes they have these large eyes, kind of like coins, and when they're in tanks, I'm not exactly sure why, but it has to do with where they look. They're normally in dark water, and so I think they're just looking all over. And when they're in a tank, for some reason they look down a lot. They look down, maybe they are depressed, I don't know. But they get these fatty deposits up here so that it's almost like, I'm going to do a car metaphor, and I'm going to totally mess it up because I don't know cars. But when the wheels are misaligned, you have to get them rotated or something like that. But so there's a plastic surgery that can be done. There's a whole cottage industry in fish plastic surgery now for the arowana, and I've actually witnessed some of these procedures, and there's a lot of drama because you have to take the fish out of the water. You put it under, you take it out of the water, and it lays there, but you got to get back in so it can breathe. So these guys have to move really fast. But you remove the fatty deposit, and the fish gets an eye lift and looks happy. And the other thing is, you don't want a fish that's PLJ. That means protruding lower jaw, and it's really like that, like really also depressed. Maybe these fish are depressed. I don't know why they're having these different features. So you can also get a chin tuck. So if your fish were to develop a PLJ, sorry, you can get a chin tuck. Yeah, so these are some things. So you do have some control over the value in that regard. But really, it's the stuff you would expect. You want a really red fish. You know, that's what you're looking for.
You mentioned some counterfeit fish.
Oh yeah, I did. Right. So the way you fake an arowana is by manipulating the coloration so that it looks like it's a variety it's not. So there are these different pockets of arowana. I mentioned that green you don't want a green, right? But there's also different kinds of gold or different kinds of red. So there's something called the Banjar red, which is not as red as the super red. But if you keep it in a certain kind of environment, it will start to turn redder, and then it'll sell for more money, and then you put it in a different environment, and it just gets back to the sort of orangey hue that it is. So this actually works most for the gold. If you keep a gold fish in a tank that's totally white, it will start to kind of adapt to its environment. They don't camouflage themselves, but they do manipulate their coloring based on what they see. Actually, this is interesting. There was a black arowana I saw once, and it turned out that it wasn't true of this fish, but generally when that happens, it's because they're blind. So they're mimicking their perceived environment of total darkness. So they do have that does have some effect on the coloration. The other thing is, I should point this out, the fish doesn't take on its coloration for 3 years for the gold and 6 for the super red. So when they reach sexual maturity, that's when they come into their full blush. And that means that if you're buying a fish, they're usually sold at about 6 months, you're buying a fish whose color you have to guess. And so I actually went with a Japanese buyer to assess, this is professionally what he does, he assesses the babies, and he tries to guess what they're going to look like when they get big. So you could potentially sell somebody a green fish, tell them it's a gold, and then 3 years later you're gone when it doesn't turn gold. Yeah, so that's the kind of fish fraud and fakes that I'm talking about.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all the time we have for questions, but thank you so much for joining us and telling us all about, telling us all about your book. So thank you everyone for coming out. Let's give a round of applause.